instructor for many years as well, and he has a strong passion for Qur'an and tafsir especially, and hence he's sharing with us his PhD topic around the names of the surahs and how it relates to their goals and their aims. It's a field which you probably don't give much attention to whenever you read surahs in the Qur'an. When you memorize surahs, I remember when I was growing up memorizing surahs, I didn't even know their names. I just know it by the first verse. And so when my mom would tell me, like, have you memorized this surah? Have you memorized that surah? And I'd be like, no, I don't know. And it turns out it was Surah Ikhlas. So there's actually a lot of wisdom in the names, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Sheikh Asif Uddin. So I'll pass on to him now, and hope you enjoy it.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so brothers and sisters, I'm going to talk through my PhD. I hope that you find it beneficial and interesting. And to be honest, I've really stopped giving talks for the last 3 or 4 months online, in person, because I have to hand in my draft by December. So I've kind of like become very reclusive, just found a cave and just tried to complete it because I was really behind a few months ago and probably got like about 10-15% left, alhamdulillah. But before talking about the topic of my PhD, I wanted to really discuss the journey before the PhD itself. So I'm kind of semi-obsessed on how to make the Qur'an relatable to the masses. Okay? And this is a really big problem that we face as Muslims. Because the key to our salvation and success in the dunya and also in the akhirah, in this world and the hereafter, is to have a close connection to the Qur'an. But that connection came into fruition during the early generations, because the companions, although many of them were not able to read the Qur'an with their eyes, in some respects they were able to read it through their heart. Whilst in our time, the opposite is true, where we're reading it with our eyes, but it's not really connecting with our hearts. So the function that the Qur'an has in our lives is related to how the Qur'an is a book of blessings and reward. And it's not used or utilized as its main function, which is of guidance. Because when we have a problem, or when we have a situation going on in our life, or we've got some question regarding some aspect of some problems that we're going through, we tend not to go to the Qur'an as a form of guidance to solve the problem for us or to answer a question, but we tend to only, perhaps if we're religious enough, we'll just use it just to read so that we can get some kind of, some kind of relaxation or some kind of blessing as a result. So prior to starting my PhD, which I started about 8 years ago, doing a PhD part-time in 6 years, but I took 2 years off due to extenuating circumstances. But prior to that, what I tried to do is I tried to explain the Qur'an in a very macro level. Okay? Because when we study the Qur'an, we tend to study the Qur'an verse by verse. And we tend not to look at, and I feel that this is not the correct way of studying the Qur'an. I feel that there's a number of steps a person needs to take in order to study the Qur'an before you even go to the verses. And it's understandable why we would do this, because our teachers and our scholars who teach the Qur'an to us, they're simply looking at the tafsirs and the exegesis of the Qur'an, who explain the Qur'an verse by verse. But one major mistake that they have made, and as a result we have fallen into, is that we have to come to the realization that the vast majority of exegesis or tafsir of Qur'an were written by scholars for scholars. And they weren't, in the main, written for the masses. So having that in mind, what I wanted to do is I wanted to do like the Qur'an for dummies, right? But not using the word dummies. So there's a couple of projects that I had. The first project was to explain the whole of the Qur'an over 2 weekends in Ramadan, and I did this surah by surah. And I did this twice, 2 times, maybe once about 15 years ago, another time I don't know when. And then I just found it too tiring, right? Because you're fasting, it's summer, it's difficult. So I said, okay, how can I do it in an easier way, or in a shorter way? So then I started doing it juz by juz, or supara by supara, the 30 sections of the Qur'an. But again, there were issues with this as well. Why? Because whilst the Qur'an was demarcated divinely by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the 30 ajza or suparas weren't. In actual fact, some scholars have even criticized the way that the Qur'an has been divided, because although there's no point changing it, because it's got qabul from the ummah, it's got acceptance from the ummah, but if you were to study it closely, the way that it's been divided is not the best way. So for instance, I'll give you an example. There's one page of Surah Hud which is found in the 12th juz, so why not just include that page into the 11th juz? It just makes sense. Why do you have to, and if you're going to do it juz by juz, especially in Tarawih, during Tarawih and just your daily readings of the Qur'an, you may just end up stopping at that juz when there's another page left of Surah Hud. It just doesn't make sense. So a number of scholars in the past have actually criticized the demarcation. But there were a number of courses that I did attend where they explained the whole of the Qur'an in a summarized way. And it was a really good effort. And they did a really good job, but I just felt that they were just going through the material. They just needed to go through the notes and that's it. So if someone were to say, okay, I want you to explain or give me a 1-minute reminder or a lecture as to what the whole of Surah Al-Baqarah is about, they wouldn't have been able to do it, because they're just going through it verse by verse or section by section without being able to find a central theme that could trigger or at least remind you of all the different sections of that surah. Because if there is a central theme or a maqsad, an overall aim, then that will make it easier to be able to see the thread of the surah and how it relates to that aim, and then you'll be able to relate everything that is actually mentioned in the surah. But the problem, again, and this is another issue, is that how do you remember 114 aims of the Qur'an, of the surahs of the Qur'an? So there was a theory that I had come across by one of the great scholars of Islam by the name of Burhanuddin al-Biqai, and he was, excuse me, about the 9th century scholar. He wrote an incredible tafsir called Nazm al-Durar. What he does is that he looks at the munasaba or the coherence of the Qur'an, surah by surah. So what is the relationship between this verse and the verse that comes after it? And he does it from a macro level. He says, what is this surah? What is this relationship with the surah that comes before and after it? And he's one of the very first scholars to do this for the entire Qur'an. But one of the theories that he did, that he posits, is that he uses a number of methodologies of how to extract the aim of the surah. And one of them was to look at the name. And so this is what my PhD in actual fact is looking at. The thesis outline is exploring the aims of the chapters of the Qur'an through its names in light of the historical context in which it was revealed. Okay? So I'm going to, very briefly, I'm not going to be able to do the whole thing, and please forgive me because it's a very basic PowerPoint presentation. like I said, I wasn't planning on doing any talks, but because I was invited by Yusuf, who's a dear brother to me, and also because it's connected to my PhD, I was hoping that by the end of this presentation, you are going to challenge me, you're going to ask me questions. I've got about a month and a half to finish it, so there's something, maybe there's a question that you ask or something that you notice that doesn't look right, I can possibly change. So in some respects it's connected to the work that I'm doing. So the whole of my research revolves around 4 chapters. Typically you'll get a literature review, and I have to begin with names. So if I'm connecting the names of the aims with the names of the surahs of the Qur'an, what names are we talking about? Right? Because there's some names, there's multiple names for a surah, and some names are tawqifi. Tawqifi means that they have been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet, they're divine. While other names are in actual fact ijtihadi, meaning that the scholars later on had in actual fact given a title to this particular chapter. So I have to begin by talking about names. Then after this, I'll start talking about the aims. I'll start talking about the idea of maqasid al-surah, what is the basis or the evidence for it from the Sharia, what are the different the scholarly engagement with regards to maqasid al-surah, what is the different ways that scholars use in order to determine a maqsad, right? All of these different things I discuss in this chapter. And then the contribution is, and conclusion is for me to come up with a criteria on how to connect names and aims, and then also answer the question as to whether this thesis holds true, or is it something that is, it's not true. So let's just go this, I'm just going to show you the like a contents page of each of the sections, and then I'll just pick on one particular thing, and then we'll discuss it in a bit more detail. So in this, in the first chapter, in the literature review, I have to effectively justify that there is a gap in this research, and I'm basically filling that gap. So I talk about the Western development of the coherence of the Qur'an. I talk about Muslim coherence during the first century. Is this something that existed? Looking at Muslim coherence through the centuries, the 4 stages, which I'll talk about very shortly. And then I talk about the concept of coherence and its organic development over the centuries and how it's actually developed. But there's one thing that I wanted to discuss, and that is the chronology of coherence of the Qur'an over the centuries. Because this discussion of the aims of the surahs of the Qur'an cannot be discussed without discussing the idea and the concept of nazm, or the concept of coherence or munasabah. So I'm going to very briefly go over the chronology of the coherence of the Qur'an, so we can get a better understanding as to where the coherence or the aims of the surahs actually fit in. So the very first thing is that the very first stage is mufradat, and mufradat means words. So as the Islamic empire is growing, it's taking over countries where they do not speak Arabic, and as a result of this, there are going to be questions that they will ask regarding certain words in the Qur'an that they're not familiar with. So even if they learn the Arabic language, because of the richness of the Qur'an, they're naturally going to be asking questions: what does this word mean? What does this word mean? But this in and of itself is a type of coherence, because one word will be connected to another word which is within the Qur'an. And there was a number of scholars like Al-Farra, Abu Ubaidah, so 207 after Hijrah, he died in 822. they discussed this in some detail. Then there was a concept of nadam. So nadam is looking at words. And I'll discuss the reason why each of these things actually occurs. And the third stage, and these are scholars like Jahiz. Jahiz was a famous Mu'tazilah scholar, died 255, and there was Baqallani, who died 403, very famous. He wrote a very famous book by the name of Ijaz al-Qur'an, or the miraculous nature of the Qur'an, or the eloquence of the Qur'an. And you have Jurjani, again, who's a great scholar relating to the Arabic language. You have a third stage here, and it's called munasaba. And munasaba is sentences. So you see a clear, development that's taking place over the centuries. First begins with word, then words, then sentences or ayat. And how one verse relates to another verse. Because there are a number of verses in the Qur'an, when someone reads it, they're like thinking, what is the connection between, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mention this? Like, what is the connection between this and what came before it? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks in Surah Al-Qiyamah, He's discussing the day of judgment, and he's going into a lot of detail, and it's really scary, and he's like saying that the sun will be eclipsed, the moon will be eclipsed, and there will be complete chaos. And then after this incredible description of the day of judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَحْمِلْ لِسَانَكَ لِتَعْجَلَ بِهِ. They do not recite the Qur'an quickly. And you're like thinking, what has this got to do with the day of judgment? Right? So some of the scholars will answer these questions by looking at sentences. What is the relationship between this verse and what came before it and what came after it? So there's an element of coherence that's actually occurring. So there are scholars like Ibn Barajan, Al-Razi, Fakhruddin Razi, and also Al-Harrani. Now you come to, what do you think will be the next one? So you got words, sentences, and then you'll have chapters, right? And this is what actually occurs as well. Or the maqsad of the mawdu. Maqsad means aim, mawdu means theme. But why are these things actually, actually there's a few people who are discussed here. So Muhammad Abdul, he is probably one of the very first scholars to write a tafsir of the Qur'an with the masses in mind. Then you had Sayyid Qutb, fi Bilal al-Qur'an, Mawdudi, Pakistani scholar or Indian scholar, and then you had Islahi, who's also a Pakistani scholar. And what they do is that they discuss the maqsad or the mawdu of the chapters of the Qur'an. So when it comes to stage one, what was the reason why this became a trend? The first thing is to protect the purity of the Arabic language. So there was a cultural reason. More and more people were coming into the converting into Islam, and they were from different cultures, and as a result of this, the language, in some respects, it's not just to explain the words, but also to protect the language itself. And this is the reason why scholars, they have a cutoff point, that any word, the Arabic language in the first 1.5 centuries within Jazirat al-Arab, within Hijaz, then this would be used as an evidence. But past that period, then they wouldn't use it as an evidence, right? So this is, I'm just making up the date, but there is actually a period that the linguists actually use to say whether this is considered to be pure Arabic, or whether it's been Arabic that has evolved as a result. Because this is the nature of the Arabic language. So for instance, as an example, the word walad in MSA, or modern standard Arabic, or al-Fusha al-Haditha, or classical modern standard Arabic, walad in actual fact means, does anyone know what it means? Any Arabs here? Anyone studying Arabic here? It means a boy, right? But walad in the classical, which is called al-Fusha al-Qadima, it's actually the classical Arabic that is found in the Qur'an and the Sunnah. It doesn't mean that. It means a child. So this is just an example of how the language evolves over time. So in order to protect the Arabic language, they put a lot of effort in bringing together dictionaries. Ibn al-Faris in Qiyas al-Lugha in the 3rd century, and Al-Thara and Al-Ubayda, and so on and so forth. And those who were involved in this endeavor were the linguists. Then we look at the reason for the second stage, and this was something called sirfa. So it was actually, in actual fact, a polemical reason, right? Sirfa was a deviant belief or proposition by one of the Mu'tazilites, not all of them, because Jahiz actually refutes this. They said, this particular individual from the Mu'tazilite sect, he said that the Qur'an is not a miracle in and of itself. Right? The Qur'an, astaghfirullah, is not a miracle in and of itself. In terms of the linguistic challenge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays down to people. Fact to be surah to mimithli, that bring a surah like it. But sirfa, this Mu'tazilite scholar, he basically says that it's not that the Qur'an is, a miracle in and of itself, but it is that Allah will, anyone who tries to challenge it, Allah will turn them away from being able to fulfill it. And that's what sirfa in actual fact means. Sarrafa means to turn something away. So this was the reason why they started to discuss the idea of null, and that is the miraculous nature of the Qur'an and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what makes it miraculous? One of the major reasons that it's miraculous is the placement of one word with another word. When you have so many different multiple ways of expressing something, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put this word next to this word, and there's a reason for this. Like for instance, as an example, when I say to you, the Day of Judgment, what comes to mind in the Arabic language? Yawm al-Qiyamah. But in the very first chapter of the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Maliki Yawm al-Din, the owner of the day of the owner of the day of the religion. So why is it that why didn't Allah use Yawm al-Qiyamah? Why did He use Yawm al-Hisab? Every single word in the Qur'an has been used for a particular reason. And the initiators behind this trend were the linguists. Then you had munasaba. Munasaba came, and Allah knows best, due to stagnation. Razi said in the introduction of his tafsir, Miftah al-Ghayb, that this is all the scholars in the past, they've tried everything, but I'm going to change it up a little bit. I'm going to change it up a little bit by introducing a few more things. And one of the things that he discusses is the idea of munasaba. He's not the very first person to discuss it, but they start to delve into this because the scholarly work when it came to tafsir had basically plateaued. And the ones who came, the initiators or the ones who, the popularizers behind this trend were the innovative thinkers. Now the final stage, which is the Maqsad Mawdu'i, which focuses on the chapter, Abdu, Qutb, Mawdudi, Islahi, and many other scholars who discuss the Qur'an from a Maqsadi perspective or a Mawdu'i perspective, from a aim perspective or from a thematic perspective, they in actual fact wrote them for a number of reasons. One of them is because they're trying to find solutions. Another is responding to Orientalists, because when Orientalists would start reading the Qur'an, such as Bell, he said this doesn't make sense. So what Bell does is that he starts looking at the verse of the Qur'an, he starts changing it. He starts changing the verses of the Qur'an. He said, no, this makes sense. The current Qur'an that the Muslims have, it doesn't make sense. So he started to change the verse order. And he said, this makes much sense, right? Because he and others, and it's become a bit of a moot point now, because a lot of the Orientalists, or they call them Islamicists, they don't really necessarily challenge the Qur'an from a coherence perspective, and they start to go into different issues now. Another reason is secularism, the rise of secularism, irreligiosity, can't say it properly, is in order to make the Qur'an accessible to the masses. So what you'll find with Abdul and Qutb and others, and Mawdudi as well, is that they'll write an introduction to the surah not just from a classical perspective by simply writing down the virtues, the asbab al-nuzul, the reasons of revelation, and so on and so forth, but they'll start to discuss what the surah is all about, giving you a macro picture of the surah before they dive into the micro. And in actual fact, the background of these scholars were in actual fact coming from an activist mentality. So Abdul, very well-known activist, Qutb, coming from Ikhwan, Maududi, Jamaat Islami, and Islahi, in actual fact, is that same kind of trend. So this is one of the points, or one of the sections that I actually have in the very first chapter on my PhD. The second is looking at the names. So names of the surahs in the Qur'an. So these are a few things that I discuss. The meanings of the word surah, are the names, there's a few mistakes, it's not capitalized, there's a couple of spelling errors, so please forgive me for that. Are the names tawqifi or ijtihadi? The definition of tawqifi, the evidences of tawqifi. So in actual fact, the majority of scholars who discuss whether the names of the Qur'an were divine or non-divine, the majority of them, they said all the names of the surahs of the Qur'an are tawqifi. They come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's so many scholars who actually held on to this opinion. Imam Suyuti rahimahullah very famously in his Itqan, in his book on the science of the Qur'an, he says that if I had the time, I would bring all the narrations to prove that all the names of the Qur'an are in actual fact divine. So because of this statement and other statements from different scholars, I came into this PhD thinking that, you know, I'm going to try to link the names with the name because the name is tawqifi. Honestly, I came into my PhD thinking this, but now I have to prove it. So I had to come up with a methodology. There's something called marfu' hukman. I have to come up. Marfu' hukman is basically a term in hadith studies where a companion narrates something, and scholars say that it's not possible that that particular companion could have come up with that statement by themselves. They must have taken it from the Prophet ﷺ. So whenever a companion talks about matters of the ghaib, of the unseen, of paradise and hellfire, but they don't attribute it to the Prophet ﷺ, they're just making it as a statement, the scholars, they say this is marfu' hukman, meaning that its ruling is that it goes and is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. So one of the things that I do as part of my research is that I come across a number of statements or names of the surahs of the Qur'an that are mentioned by some of the companions. So if there's one companion who mentions it, it's quite possible that it could be ijtihadi, because there are a number of companions, such as Ibn Abbas, who mentions the name of the surah, and it's just his own ijtihad. He makes it up himself, there is that flexibility to do that. But one of the things that I do is that I look at names of the surahs that have been mentioned by multiple companions, and so it's logical to make the jump that this name, if it's mentioned by multiple number of companions, could come to the level of it being attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore becoming something which is tawqifi and not something which is ijtihadi. So anyway, I come up with a methodology, and then I come up with the results, which I'll show very shortly. But just to go through some of the other things that I mentioned in this chapter is so as you can tell from some of the titles in this section, I come to the conclusion that not all the names of the surahs of the Qur'an are tawqifi. Okay? And since that is the case, why is it we do not have a name for every surah? So this is something I discuss. Then I talk about the context of how names were reported. Right? And then I talk about the usage of weak hadith, because everyone gets scared of weak hadith, right? But in this context of names of the surahs of the Qur'an, I use as part of my criteria, my methodology, to say that it's fine to use as long as the weakness of the hadith is not very weak. If it's very weak, I will not use it. But if it's that for Yasir, it's just a little bit weak or something like this, then I will accept it. So I'll just show you some of the things I found. So I was able to, by looking at all the books of hadith or anything that I could get a hold of, I was able to extract 628 reports that mention the names of the surahs of the Qur'an. And 167 of them were hadith and 461 were athar, or they were reports from the companions. But I did also look at the tabi'in. And this is an example of one of the 628 reports that I found. And this is just one example. So Anas ibn Malik said, the Messenger of Allah said, there is a chapter in the Qur'an that consists of only 30 verses which will argue on behalf of its companion until it causes him to enter paradise, and its chapter is Tabarak, which is Surah Mulk. And then I go into where is reported the authenticity of the report and so on and so forth. So I put this all on an Excel sheet. Can everyone see that? So I put this all on an Excel sheet, and I divide the different names into 5 different categories. So if you look on the far right, okay, it says the green is tawqif, meaning it's come from the Prophet ﷺ, it's authentic. The blue is it is tawqifi, coming from the Prophet ﷺ, but there's some weakness in it. But I still accept it, because it's not really weak. It's just moderately weak, or it's just a little bit weak. And it's acceptable when discussing the names of the surahs of the Qur'an. It's not being used in Aqidah, it's not used in fiqh, where there's a difference of opinion amongst the scholars as to whether weak hadith can be used as an evidence in those fields. The yellow is tawqifi, I consider it to be a tawqifi, but it's marfu' hukman, right? It's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ without attributing it to him. The orange is that it's ijtihad. It comes from a weak athar or from a sole report. So if there's only one companion who comes up with the name of the surah, and he's the only companion, only companion to mention that particular name, then I would consider this not to be tawqifi, but ijtihadi, because it may just be that particular companion's own reasoning. And the final one, which is the grey one, is that it's very weak, it's a very weak athar. So looking through these 628 reports, I made this Excel sheet and I put all of the names I can find. And not only the names, but also look at all the different reports. So as you can see in the cells, just taking one example, let's look at Al-Baqarah. Yeah, so if you look at Al-Baqarah, right next to it, it says Sahih and then it says 5, right? And you can see a little red dot, which means that there's a comment if you hover the cursor over it. But then if you go a bit further, it says under Athar, because I've divided into Hadith and Athar, it says 6, and then it's got 7 in the brackets. Can you guys see that? Yes, that is I-10. Yeah, so it's cell I-10. And the reason for that is because I've listed out all of the different narrations of companions who mention the word Baqarah. So for instance, Aisha radiallahu anha, she comes up twice. So there's 6 companions but there's 7 reports. That's the reason why it says 6 and then 7 in brackets. So Aisha radiallahu anha, Bukhari Muslim, Jabir ibn Abdullah, Bukhari Muslim, Abdullah ibn Abbas, Bukhari Muslim, Abdurrahman bin Yazid, Bukhari Muslim, Usayd ibn Hudayr, Bukhari, Hudayfa, Muslim. Right? So it's clearly an authentic hadith. So this is the results that I came up with. So I consider tawqifi to be of 3 levels of authenticity. The first one is green, which is tawqifi sahih. The second one is weak, but it's accepted, which is the blue one, which is tawqifi da'if. And the yellow one, the third one, is tawqifi indirect. And then the final one, ijtihadi, is weak or a sole reporter. So the number of surahs, obviously in the whole of the Qur'an, 114, but I was able to find that from the authentic ones, there were tawqifi sahih, there were 32, and there were 28 of those names which are contemporary names, names that we actually use ourselves. that we have in the Mus'haf. But they were not necessarily the exact name. Okay, so what I mean by that is that you'll have Surah Sajda, and it will be Alif, the report would say Alif Lam Mim Sajda, right? So I didn't want to be so strict and say it's not exactly a Sajda, but the actual report says Alif Lam Mim Sajda. Do you understand? So I didn't want to be so strict. As long as the name was in there, some of the scholars, they basically use that over time to be the mainstay name of that surah. And there will be multiple names. So for instance, Surah Ghafir, there's another name for Surah Ghafir, which is the 40th chapter of the Qur'an. Does anyone know what it is? Sorry? Surah Mu'min, right? So if you actually have, there's two types of mushafs that we have, what I call the Pakistani mushaf and the Arab mushaf, right? So the Arab one, which is called the Naskhi script, right? It'll have Surah Ghafir as the 40th chapter. But then you'll have in the other mushaf, which is using the Farsi script, it will use the name Surah Mu'min. Same thing with Surah Al-Insan, Surah Al-Dahr, and there's a couple of variations. So Surah Ghafir, in actual fact, is not a tawqifi name, but Surah Mu'min is. Right? So there was some flexibility in how I understood the results, or how I put the results together. The third chapter that I looked at, it's the most recent one that I completed, is does the surah have a maqsad? So I look at the concept of maqasid the surah, and the real difficulty with this particular chapter is I didn't want to repeat what was mentioned in the literature review. So it was a really big challenge. This chapter was a really big challenge because it's so easy to go over all the books that have been written on Maqasid the Surah and then discuss it in a lot of detail. The significance of Maqasid the Surah, that how by studying Maqasid the Surah, will it be able to explain the Qur'an, the surahs of the Qur'an, and give a better tafsir of the Qur'an in a better way? The basis or the foundation of the surah, like someone said, okay, brother, you're coming up with something new. This is a bid'ah you're doing. This is an innovation. So how do I prove that this has in actual fact existed? So then I mentioned a report from the time of the companions where there was a discussion relating to what we can understand as being the companions discussing the aim of the surah of the Qur'an. Then scholarly engagement with Maqasid Surah. So there's about 47 books that I look at, and I bring 47 scholars, because some scholars had written multiple books on Maqasid Surah. So I look at the scholarly engagement that they have with Maqasid Surah and how they look at it. And the final thing that I look at is the methodological approaches to determining Maqasid Surah. So from everything that I have read, from the books on Maqasid Surah, I then look at the ways that they extract the maqsad of the surah. So there's 50 different ways. Some of the scholars will look at the beginning of the surah, some of them will look at the end of the surah, some of them will look at the beginning and the end, so that's a third. Some of them will be looking at it from a structural perspective. Some of them in actual fact will be looking at it connecting or extracting the aim of the surah from its name. Right? So then you can challenge me and say, look, how are you doing your PhD if there's scholars already doing this? But my contribution, which is the fourth chapter, is coming up with a criteria. Because, first of all those scholars who discuss the connection between the name and the aim of the surahs, none of them actually explain why they chose that particular name in the first place. They didn't say, yes, this is a tawqifi name, or if they did, they didn't prove it. So this is where I'm basically filling the gap. And the final chapter, which I'm in the middle of writing, is the conclusion and contribution. So anyone who's doing a PhD will know that you have to do a restatement of the research problem and the aim, give a synthesis of the key findings of the previous chapters. And now my original contribution is to come up with a criteria. And my my criteria is based on the chapters that I've done before. That is, first of all, what names are we talking about? And I'm going to focus only on the tawqifi names. So this is the first thing. The second thing is that, okay, how do I deal with the multiplicity of names? And then I will use the name which is most popular if there are multiple tawqifi names. Then I'll look at the historical context of the name. And then also, this is quite important as well, the second criteria that I use is when we're looking at the name, how are we understanding that name? Because words have different meanings. There is a haqiqi understanding of a word, the literal understanding of a word, because there is actually a book, a whole book, like 400-500 pages, which is really interesting, but I don't agree with the author, where he looks at each of the names of the surahs, but he looks at the name from a linguistic perspective. So for instance, he looks at Baqarah, Surah Al-Baqarah, and he basically says that one of the meanings of Al-Baqarah, it means vastness. Yeah, it means something which is very wide, because Surah Al-Baqarah is a very wide, very strong, very vast surah. And this is one of the aims he comes up with connecting. He says, but he doesn't give too much importance to the contextual understanding of the word Baqarah and how it was used in the surah, which was in the context of the Surah Al-Baqarah. Right? So this is the reason why I have to come up with the second criteria. There's other ways. There's an ishari or symbolic understanding of a word. There's a theological understanding of a word. So for instance, Surah Al-Ikhlas. You can't look at the name of that surah without understanding it from a theological lens. The second thing that the third criteria that I use is to look at the main aim. So I apply this to Surah Al-Baqarah, and it's really frustrating because you're only allowed to write 100,000, at least I'm allowed in my university, I don't know what it's like in Cambridge, but I'm only allowed to write 100,000 words, right, in this PhD, which is really frustrating because I was hoping to do maybe 6 surahs or 7 or 8 surahs and for my conclusion contribution. And so far I've only been able to do Al-Baqarah, which is really horrible because I spent 7.5 years researching this, and probably more than that, because whenever anyone does a PhD, they're thinking a lot about the PhD to begin with. And now I can only do one surah. It's very horrible. So I'm trying to find a way of being able to cut down from other chapters. But one of the things that I do is that I gather all the aims of Surah Al-Baqarah from those scholars who have actually mentioned an aim, and I come up with around 32. So 32 different aims. There will be overlap of Surah Al-Baqarah. And then what I do is that I summarize, or I give a unifying aim for that surah. Because sometimes some scholars, when they describe, they conflate themes with aims. Because someone will say, is it Muhammad al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he says an example that Surah Al-Baqarah is Surah Al-Taqwa. It's the surah of God consciousness. But that's a theme, that's not really an aim. You could say another surah is like Surah of Taqwa, right? You're not really telling us, like some scholars may say this surah is about Tawheed. Yeah, but there's another surah that's about Tawheed as well. Now, what is the difference between this surah and another surah? So one of the things that I do is that I try to make a difference between those scholars who give a thematic aim and those what I call give a unifying a unifying aim for that particular surah, where they're coming up with one particular overarching aim which encompasses the different themes within the surah. And the final criteria is the revelatory circumstances, right? Because you cannot isolate the aim of the surah from when it was revealed. And this is so important. And that's the reason why in my thesis, it's not just connecting the aims and the names, but in the context, in the historical, in the contextual historical perspective of when it was revealed, which has huge implications. Not just only from a Makkah and Madani period, but also at what point was it revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, in which him and his companions needed that at that particular time. So the limitations of the, I'll discuss limitations of study and avenues for future research. So that's what I wanted to present, but hopefully there's some questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead.
Sorry, guys, you know what this is, QR code, scan it, and you can send in your questions, and I'll see them on my laptop. If anyone has a question they want to raise from the floor though, at the back.
So thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. And I wanted, if you may, for you to elaborate on some of the actual substance or content that you're not able to put in your PhD. You alluded to Baqarah, but just to give us some of the flavor of what you've come across with regards to the names of the surahs and the themes and how they might relate.
Okay, so when I was discussing this presentation with my supervisor, she said, don't mention this. She said, keep the audience on the edge. Okay. Some of the surahs that I wanted to discuss. Baqarah is a very obvious one because it's the largest surah in the Qur'an. So many topics are discussed. It's probably the richest from a thematic perspective, so it makes sense to discuss Surah Al-Baqarah. Some others that I really wanted to discuss are Surah Yunus. Why is Yunus interesting?
Because I think Prophet Yunus is mentioned more in Surah Hud.
Sorry, Prophet Yunus
Prophet
is?
Yunus is mentioned more in Surah Hud than in Surah.
Yes, but there is something else as well, and that is that Yunus alayhi salam is only mentioned once in the whole of the surah. He's mentioned in one verse, and it's, in actual fact, he's not even mentioned. It's his people who are mentioned. So you'll get prophets who are mentioned far more than Yunus alayhi salam. Like Nuh alayhi salam is mentioned, and there's other prophets who are mentioned in Surah Yunus. So what is the sir? What is the secret behind the surah being called Surah Yunus? Now, if I'm going to propose come up with this proposition of linking the name with the name, then how do I get around the idea of some surahs being named after the huruf al-muqattarat, right? So Surah Taha, Surah Yasin, right? So these are some of the more challenging surahs that I really wanted to cover. So I'll mention something regarding Surah Yunus because I find this surah to be really fascinating. And the reason why Surah Yunus is mentioned as a name is because what is so special about Yunus in Islam? What's unique about Yunus in Islam?
That in a sense he made a quote unquote mistake.
Not that he made a mistake.
His people followed him. His people repented and actually followed him.
Exactly. So his people, they repented, they accepted Islam before the punishment came. Okay. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to cover this chapter in my in the fourth section, because the thesis was connected the aim of the name in the context of when it was revealed. Because if you look at Surah Yunus, it was revealed alongside two other surahs. Surah Hud, that comes after it, in not only just chronologically, but also we have it in the Mus'haf. And then after Surah Yusuf. When a lot of scholars and du'at, speakers, they talk about Surah Yusuf, I don't know why they only do this Surah Yusuf. They should really do this with every surah that they cover. Is that they give a historical background, the circumstances in which Surah Yusuf was revealed. And this was revealed when Khadija radiallahu anha passed away, Abu Talib passed away. This is when the Prophet went to Ta'if. So it was a really difficult time for the Prophet ﷺ, and that's the reason why they call that year Am al-Huzn, the year of sadness. So they always give a historical context, which is great. But this is the things that I just mentioned are relevant for those two surahs as well. So Surah Yunus, in actual fact, and this is the reason. This is my theory based on some works of the scholars as well, is that it's giving a threat to the Quraysh, and that is, not a threat, an encouragement to the Quraysh that you should be like the people of Yunus, alayhi salam. Become Muslim, accept Islam before the punishment comes upon you. But if it doesn't, if you don't, then you will be like the people of Surah Hud. Because the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what did he describe Surah Hud as being? What did he say about Surah Hud? Yeah, he says, Shayabatni Hud wa akhawat. That Hud and her sisters, they turn my hair grey. Because this is considered to be one of the more frightening surahs of the Qur'an. And this is a surah of punishment. So it's like a message to the Quraysh that accept Islam like the people of Yunus. And if you don't, then the punishment will come upon you. But then Yusuf is very, people may, it's not just about the story of Yusuf al-Islam. Saying that it's a story of Yusuf al-Islam is just is a thematic aim. It's more than that. Because we have to connect the surahs of the Qur'an to the Prophet ﷺ in what he's going through. And so Surah Yusuf, in actual fact, one of the main messages of Surah Yusuf is stating to the Quraysh that whatever path you take, whatever efforts that you make, at the end of the day, the Prophet ﷺ will have tamkeen, the Muslims will have tamkeen, they'll have establishment on the earth. And this is exactly what happened with Yusuf alayhi salam. So this is just like a little flavor, maybe some things that I'm not sure if I have time to include it into the PhD. Let's see. Any other questions?
Sheikh, you can choose, I think.
I wanted to ask, has your research changed the way you read or recite Quran and how you reflect on the surahs? Has anything changed?
Yeah, I think it has changed, and even when I'm reading the surahs, it makes me think, okay, how does this, I view the surah, the verses that I read from the surah in light of the maqsad or the aim that I'm familiar with. But it may be the case, and I found this really fascinating, is that when I was compiling the different aims of Surah Al-Baqarah, I came across 32 different aims. Not 32 different aims, because like I said, there was some overlap, but 32 aims written by scholars. One of the things that I looked at after categorizing those aims into 5 broad, unique aims that they mentioned, is to see if there's an evolution. Like, for instance, one of the things that a lot of scholars mention regarding Surah Al-Baqarah is the idea of istikhlaf, and that is the idea of one of the major aims, or if not the main aim of Surah Al-Baqarah, is that of being a stewardship, vice regency of, or being responsible for the earth. But did the classical scholars in actual fact mention this? Right? So this is one of the things that I noticed. But yeah, for sure, definitely. When I'm, one of the things that I have, one of the things that I do whenever I read the Qur'an is that I look to see how this particular verse connects to the verses around it, but also as a surah as a whole. But I'm a bit more aware of that than before I started doing this research.
Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the things that some of the scholars mention as to the reason why certain names were given those titles is because that particular word was not mentioned anywhere else in the Quran. So for instance, Quraysh, which is really surprising, is only mentioned in one chapter of the Quran, which is Surah Quraysh. Same thing with Araf as well, same thing with Nahl, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't think this is a strong reason. So for instance, Al-Baqarah as an example, right? So some scholars, they said that the reason why it's called Surah Al-Baqarah is because of the story of the cow, which is unique to that chapter, and it's not found anywhere else in the Quran. But if you were to use that same reasoning, then why not Ba'udha? Allah says, He gives the parable of the fly. Why not the story of Jalut? This is the only time that the story of Talut and Jalut, Surah Talut, is mentioned in the whole of the Quran. So why is it that those names or those words were not used, but this particular word was used? So although it is true that there were, but the example with Yunus is a bit different because so many other prophets were mentioned, right? And it was not like Yunus and Islam, this is the only time that he's mentioned in the whole of the Quran. But why is it that the whole of the chapter was named after him, and yet him and his people, and his people in particular, were mentioned in just one verse? Where Surah Nuh alayhi salam was mentioned, a lot more. Musa alayhi salam was mentioned a lot more, right?
But then how do we connect it to the end? So for example, Surah Naml. So how did you, for example, connect that to the maqsad of Surah?
Yeah, so there may be a symbolic reason, right? So for instance, Surah Naml, what does Surah Naml talk about? Sulaiman alayhi salam. Sulaiman alayhi salam, what is he known for?
His power.
Yes, his power, but more in particular, his civilization. And Naml, or the ants, are known for their civilization, as in how they live as a society. Like anyone who's looked into ants, and studied, how ants live, it's just phenomenal. It's just incredible, like how they make these ant colonies, right? So there is actually a connection between the idea of Naml and then also the themes that which is within the surah. But I'm not going to be able to go through every single surah and explain that. Maybe I'll be my second PhD, or maybe I'll write a book after this.
Earlier you mentioned Surah Qiyamah, that it appears to be about resurrection, but in the middle of the surah there's some ayahs about not repeating or reciting the Quran quickly.
Yeah.
And it appears disconnected. And I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on what scholars have said about that.
Yeah, so Professor Abdul Halim wrote a very nice paper on this, where he talks about something called suspended verses, or verses which seem out of sync, or they don't seem to relate or connect to the verse that came before or after it. And this is the power of looking at the maqasid, or the maqsad of the surah, because it will give you an insight as to why topics are discussed. So for instance, in Surah Al-Baqarah, it begins by discussing three types of people: the believers, disbelievers, hypocrites. Then it starts talking about the challenge of the Quran. Then it talks about the story of Adam alayhi salam in about 10 verses. Then it goes on for about 120 verses talking about the history of the Bani Israel. So why is there a jump between these different topics? By understanding the maqsad of the surah, but obviously not trying to find the maqsad and getting all those things to fit your maqsad, but to do it in a methodological way, you'll be able to appreciate why these topics actually change. But regarding this thing about Surah Al-Qiyamah, which is quite interesting that some of the scholars have actually mentioned, is because when someone reads that very first, the opening passage of Surah Al-Qiyamah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is very graphic about some of the things that are mentioned relating to the Day of Judgment, and how He will resurrect your bones, even the tips of your fingers, which is unique to every single human being. The sun will be eclipsed, the moon will be eclipsed, and there will be chaos on the earth. The natural response is that a person will become so scared that they will try to implement the whole of Islam in one day. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet to take it easy, to do things step by step. لا تحرك لسانك لتعجل به. Do not recite the Qur'an in a quick way. Take it easy, do things gradually, do things step by step. Because if a person were to, so this is the hikmah, or the reasoning, the wisdom, as to what is the connection between the two.
For the talk. I just wanted to ask a question on the way that you sort of categorize the several aims that you're able to find in any given chapter that you look at. I've always understood like any chapter to basically personally appeal to every single person, which means that every individual will be able to take out a different aim from that chapter. So based on that, like when you do, to take the example that you mentioned, you have the 32 aims that you're able to find from scholarly works about Surah Al-Baqarah. What is sort of like the process by which you kind of categorize it, and then at the end of it, sort of take out like a singular main aim of that chapter?
So, looking at those 32 aims as an example of Surah Al-Baqarah, I will start dividing them up into different categories. So, for instance, some scholars they say Surah Al-Baqarah is trying to emphasize the that the Qur'an is a book of guidance. Right? Others will actually say that it's a warning not to be like the Bani Israel. Then others will actually say that it's actually looking at the idea of being responsible for the earth. That there's an idea of istikhlaf, meaning that the Bani Israel were the chosen ummah, but now that transference has now happened with the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the chapter or the story of the cow, in actual fact, is showing us the qualities that as an ummah we shouldn't have, right? So it's just basically just looking at every single aim and looking at the main quality that they are mentioning and just categorizing it. And I was able to put it into about five different categories. So it's just a matter of just going over them and just seeing what is the major quality that they are discussing. And once I've actually done that, then I can actually try to find a unifying aim for, well, a summary of all of those 32 aims. But then another thing that I do is that I try to see, is there a particular scholar who was the closest who came to that particular aim that I put together. So that was just the process that I went through.
I guess I'm speaking more about like the personal appeal of the Quran, which is that in any given chapter when you're reflecting on the verses, situationally in terms of like time and space, sure, the Quran appeals to you in a different way.
Yeah.
That's one of its miracles. So how do you reconcile with that idea? In respect to like the way that you're conducting your PhD, in that your literal aim of the PhD is to find singular aims across the different chapters that you're looking at.
Yeah, so what you mentioned regarding a personal relationship that person has with the Quran, a person's not necessarily saying that I'm coming up with an aim. They're just basically saying that I have a particular relationship with the surah really appeals to me, it really helps me. There's some verses that are really powerful, that quite transformational for my life. That's very different to saying that the surah has one overarching aim, that the scholars are changing. And like I said, that there's a particular methodology that scholars have used, and I've come across 15, and maybe more. I haven't been able to read everything on the idea, as many things I've been able to read on the Qasr Surah. I can't say for sure it's everything. They go through a particular methodology of how to extract that aim. And a person, and like I said, there is one thing that I noticed that some scholars did, and something that a lot of people would naturally do, is conflate the concept of aim with theme. So for instance, someone may say, I gave the example of Surah Al-Baqarah with taqwa as an example, right? But there may be something in, in a particular chapter, and it comes up over and over and over again, which may point to its aim, but it's not necessarily something that you could state as an aim. It may be a theme, because a theme is only one part of the surah, and the aim represents the whole of the surah. As some of the scholars, they say that this is the thread that connects all the beads together. Whilst some people they would consider those beads, some of those beads, to be a particular theme. So unless someone's had a bit of training or someone's gone through a particular, methodological, gone through some steps in order to determine what the aim is, it's not something that should be encouraged or someone that could do by themselves. There is a difference. What God mentions the shakhsiyya of the surah, the personality of the surah that attracts someone. That's different to what I'm discussing, and that is related to an overarching aim of the surah that determines or explains to us the different themes that are contained within it. Okay, any other questions?
There are quite a few anonymous ones.
Okay. Why are they anonymous? They're scared of me or something.
How do Tawfiqi names which are divinely inspired, contribute to understanding the coherence of the Qur'an?
That was my question. I wanted to understand.
Sorry?
That was my question. I wanted to
Okay. So how do the Tawqifi names give us an understanding of the coherence of the...
Yeah, contribute to understanding.
Contributing to understanding the coherence. So I suppose that's the whole research. And that is that if I'm able to prove that there is a connection between the name and the aim, then this will give coherence to the chapter itself. Okay? So for instance, I give you an example. When you look at Surah Al-Baqarah, it has so many different stories in it, it has so many different, so many themes in it, but then the surah's name is being taken from one short passage in the chapter, which is about maybe 7 or 8 verses. And those 7 or 8 verses revolve around some of the Bani Israel asking Musa alayhi salam to find out who killed a person who's murdered. So he says, go and kill a cow. And then they say, what kind of cow? Should it be old or young? And he says, it should be this type. He says, what type of cow should it be? And they start continuously asking many, many questions. Until they could have, prior to asking this question, they could have killed any cow. And then it was narrowed down to one particular cow, a yellow cow. So then how does this connect to the rest of the chapter? Because this surah, and this goes back to the historical, you have to look at the historical context in which the surah was revealed, because this is a surah that was revealed over 10 years, but the beginning of it was revealed in the beginning of the commencement of the Madani period. So the Makkan period is the foundation of Islam, talking about Aqidah, theology, and talking about belief. Whilst the Madani period was looking at establishing a society with rules in them. Those rules at this point haven't been revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, but they are going to be revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. So the companions are being taught a number of lessons here. The first one is not to accept, and this is one of the very core aims of the surah, and that is of taslim, of compliance. Complying to rules that you don't necessarily understand. So don't be like the Bani Israel by ensuring that whatever rules that are going to come up in the Madani period to the companions, make sure you comply. Because the first half of the surah is really talking about istikhlaf, or the idea of succession. That's probably the best definition of istikhlaf, succession. Because the very first story was about Adam Islam. He is the Khalifa, and we have placed on this earth a Khalifa, a successor. And then it goes on to talk about a long history of the Bani Israel, who were considered to be the chosen Ummah. But because they failed in fulfilling their covenant, this istikhlaf, the succession, was again given to the Ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. So they've been given tarbiyah, and they're being educated by being told not to fall into the very same mistakes as the Bani Israel. So the first half, in actual fact, is talking about the idea of istikhlaf or succession, whilst the second half of the surah, in actual fact, lays down the Sharia, or lays down the foundations of the legal system within the Sharia. So whilst the Bani Israel, and this incredible irony that takes place where they've been asking all these different questions to Prophet Musa, and they're not beneficial questions at all. In the second half of the surah, you get so many questions that are coming up. Yas'alunaka, that they ask you. But these questions are not like the questions of the Bani Israel, but they are questions that are beneficial for the Ummah at large. But even the companions were very scared to ask questions to the Prophet ﷺ because they realized that it would actually have a consequence. Umar ibn Khattab famously said that we would not ask the Prophet ﷺ too many questions. We would wait for the Bedouins to come, and we would gather around to listen to their questions so the Prophet ﷺ would answer. And the Prophet ﷺ would censure those who would ask questions which are not beneficial. One person, he said, Ya Rasulullah, you said that Hajj is obligatory. Is it obligatory upon us every single year? And he scolded him. He said, if it is, would you be able to do it? Because the questions that the Sahaba would be asking are part of the revelatory process of what will determine how generations that will come after the companions would live by in the form of Islam. So this is the reason why the name, I argue, I haven't actually hit it yet, but I would argue that the name would not only tell us what the aim is, but it will also give you a coherence and give us an understanding to everything around that particular surah.
The next question, what are the implications if you come across a surah which name you can't track, you can't see if it was its origin basically? Are there any implications to that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I mentioned in the results is that there were quite a few surahs that, well, not too many, but there were some surahs that I wasn't able to find a Tawqifi name for. And this is the reason why I mentioned, why is it that we don't have a Tawqifi name for every single surah of the Qur'an? But some of the names, I would argue, although I haven't gone into this level of research, and I suppose this will be a future study, is that when did those names appear and who came up with them? So for instance, a number of names came up. We do actually have Tawqifi names for surahs, but they're not necessarily contemporary. So we have, for example, Surah Qul Huwallahu Ahad. You'll find this quite a lot, where you have, and it's quite interesting that you mentioned this in the introduction. You didn't know the name, you only knew the name from the beginning, or the very opening verse of the chapter. That there are quite a few surahs which their name is taken from the opening chapter, but they didn't become the name that we have in the Mus'haf. So Surah Al-Ikhlas, there's no Tawqifi name for it, as far as I remember. And I would argue that it's quite possible that these scholars who initiated these names perhaps did it with this in mind, that there is an overarching aim behind that name, and that's the reason why they gave that particular surah a name.
The next question is about how do we then take this information about the aim of the name when we do our personal levels, considering we're not able to check if a surah name is tawfiqi or not, or implications of that, or we don't have the training to tie surahs together in our personal level, at our level. Because you mentioned at the beginning that one of your aims is to make the Qur'an accessible for everyone at the beginning stage as well. So how are we supposed to then take this information for our own to the
Yeah, so when I began this research, what I was trying to do is that I wanted, and I think I probably should have mentioned this in the introduction, that those courses that summarize the Quran, went over the Quran, and they did a good job of it, but if you were to ask me, okay, what is this surah about, then I'll just very superficially mention a couple of things, but I'll be able to give you a comprehensive, a good answer. What the aim of this PhD initially was supposed to do, and I'm not going to be able to do this unfortunately, maybe I will in the future, is to allow the names of the surahs of the Quran be like a type of contents page. So the name, you'll have the name of the surahs, and right next to it you'll have the aim. And like I said, you'll find it very difficult to memorize 114 aims of the surahs of the Quran. It's very difficult to do that. But one way of being able to ease that process is for at least there to be like a trigger where you are able to connect the aim with the name. So this is one of the things that I wanted to do. But I don't know if I'm going to be able to, at what point I'm going to be able to do this, because I'm actually, straight after this PhD, I'm working on another project, which I think will probably be better in terms of making the Quran accessible to people, and I'll probably put more effort into that than my own PhD, to be honest. But this is something that I kind of thought of whilst I was doing my PhD. I did like a side project, and I just had like a bit of a eureka moment. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to complete that anytime soon, but maybe at some point, inshallah.
Okay, so one question. What are the limitations of language in the act of translation in trying to make the Quran more accessible to the masses? For example, some languages may not have the words to describe certain Arabic concepts, especially because you mentioned surahs that you can interpret the name in multiple different ways, literal, figurative, theological. So from your knowledge, what are the ways to mitigate the disparities in one or quality of translation of surah names?
I think most of the names have pretty much been, when you will be able to understand why the name has been given. It's not like in this opinion that I mentioned, or this book that I was referring to, where the author just looked at the name of the surah from a purely linguistic sense, or I shouldn't say purely linguistic sense, but he used it as the main, the main or the first reasoning behind how he would determine the name, and then he would use other reasons, other understandings of that word. But generally speaking, I think everyone will be able to understand why the name of the surah is being mentioned to begin with. Right? So for instance, any surah that you can think of, Surah Salah, because Salah is mentioned in the surah, so you don't have to go into a whole research as to why, the different meanings of the word Salah. There may be, I don't know, Surah Mulk, right? Because you understand why the word Mulk can be mentioned. So you don't have to go through the 4 or 5 different, understandings of how a word can be determined. I just have to do that because from an academic perspective, I need to ensure that I have a particular methodology or a particular process that I go through in being able to choose the meaning of a particular word when they're making multiple meanings. So that's more of an academic exercise that I'm going through. So you don't no one really needs to do that. So generally speaking, the names of the surah of the Quran, they're easily translatable and they be translated in a decent way.
Before I continue, are there any more on the floor questions?
postulated any of your own names based on your understanding of the aims? Obviously not the tawqif, for the ijtihadi ones.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be able to do that. I think it would be, I think it's better just to work on the names that we have, because they have been given those names for a particular reason. And I don't think it would be correct for me to, posit any new names. In some respects, I think it would be quite dangerous for me to do something like that. So I'm just building on what the scholars have mentioned before, and I'm just putting it together, and I'm just kind of categorizing it. And I think that is something safer and better to do, because I can't necessarily come up with a name that is not being mentioned before. Like for instance, that's going to go into a big discussion. I'd feel very uncomfortable to come up with a name of a surah of the Qur'an, or to articulate it a different way that scholars have mentioned before.
Sheikh, this leads to another question about how then, when producing works, what separates a good progression and contribution as opposed to something which is negative, innovation, which is plain white?
So can you just ask that again?
So when producing works, what do you think separates progression from basically bid'ah?
Oh, right, okay. I think it's really important that whenever anyone does any research, especially in the Western academic field, that we respect the scholars. One of the things that unfortunately I came across, it didn't happen often, is that some scholars, they would say that I'm going to come up with something no one else has ever come up with, and I'm going to come up with the best book ever on this particular topic. And I really did not like that. I think it's really important to be humble, to understand that the scholars have done an incredible job of producing different works in different fields, and it's just about you can come up with something new without it being something which is something new, which is blameworthy, right? So I'll give you an example, right? So there's another project that I'm working on. I said that there's another research I'm working on that is that I'm probably putting more effort into than my current than the PhD that I'm working on, and that is basically looking at, the PhD in actual fact is one part of a bigger process that I'm using in this particular project. So at the beginning of the introduction of this presentation, I mentioned that when people, they study tafsir, or they study the Qur'an, they study it verse by verse. And I said that there are a number of steps that someone really should do before reaching that level, right? In actual fact, I think that this is the advanced level. So I've come up with a 5-step process. The very first step that I look at, and this is an example, I am answering the question to show you an example of something that I'm coming up with something new, but ensuring that it's not something which is like a bid'ah or something which is, I'm trying to come up with a new contribution without it being blameworthy, but rather being positive. So the very first thing is we are looking at when we study the Qur'an, we're looking at one verse. But there's a few steps that we need to take before looking at that one verse. And that is, the very first step is to look at the Qur'an as a whole. So one of the things that I do is that I try to look at all the books and works that discuss the idea of the maqasid al-Qur'an. What is the aim of the Qur'an? And some of the scholars, they divided the Qur'an into 3 or 4 or 5, 6 different sections based on what they consider to be the main theme or the main aim of the Qur'an. So I bring around, I think it's like 30 different scholars, and I look at all of them from the early generation to contemporary, what they consider to be the aim of the Qur'an. Then, what I do after this is that I look at so if I'm able to understand what the aims of the Qur'an are, how much of those aims are mentioned in the Qur'an? So for instance, if one of the aims of the Qur'an is Tawheed or Aqeedah or belief, what is the percentage of belief that is mentioned in the Qur'an? And if there's something else, another aim, or a third aim, or a fourth aim, how much of the Qur'an is represented by that particular aim? And then to look at some of the main verses, or the main surahs, which represent that aim. The second step is to look at surahs which are Makki and Madani. So as we know, there were some surahs that were revealed prior to the hijrah of the Prophet of the migration, some that were revealed after. So are there particular, because when scholars discuss this, many scholars discuss this, what they do is that they try to use examples of what is the difference between a Makki and Madani surah. So they'll say all the surahs in the Quran that mention the story of Adam, they're all Makki except for Surah Al-Baqarah. So they use this as a way of determining the difference between Makki and Madani surahs, but they're not necessarily telling us, some of them, not all of them, they're not necessarily telling us what is the aim of Makki surahs, what is the aim of Madani surahs. What are the major themes? They do discuss this. A lot of them do discuss this. And what is the major themes of the Makki surahs? What are the major themes of the Madani surahs? So then I'll look at each of these things and then look at it from a perspective, percentage perspective, and looking at data. Then the third thing is, after looking at the Makki and the Madani section, which is the second step, the third step is to look at looking at the hadith of Prophet ﷺ. I wrote my master's dissertation on this hadith, and the Prophet ﷺ divided the whole of the Quran into 4 sections. He said that I was given the Sab'a al-Kiwar, the 7 surahs in place of the Torah. I was given the Ma'in surahs in place of the Zabur of Dawood alayhi salam. I was given the Mathani in place of the Injil, and I was favored with the Mufassal surahs. So looking at these 4 different types of surahs, sections of the Quran that the Prophet mentioned, what themes do we find in them? And again, it's really fascinating, really, really fascinating. So for instance, if you look at the Torah, what does Torah mean? What is the main ingredients or the context of the Torah? Commandments or law. The word Torah in actual fact means law. And if you look at the Sab'a al-Kiwar, the long 7 surahs, the majority of the laws that are found in the Quran are found in these long 7 surahs. Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Nisa, Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah Al-Anfal, Tawbah, so on and so forth. There's so many laws that are mentioned in them. So there's actually some connection. Like what is it in Dawood, the Zabur of Dawood al-Islam? Can we parry or can we find a parallel between that and the Madani surahs? Right? So the point is that you're kind of zooming, you're starting off with the Quran, going to Makki Madani surahs, then going into these 4 different sections of the Quran, then you're going into the 30 ajza of the Quran, and then you're going into the surah of the Quran, which is my PhD, and then hopefully by that time I'll be able to come up with an aim for every single surah. Although scholars have done this, but they're doing it in a more methodological way, in a consistent way, of explaining why I've come up with that aim, which a lot of scholars haven't done. They come up with some of them have come up with a methodology, but they don't give a reasoning as to why they came up with that aim based on the methodology. So I'm hoping to do that in this particular project. And then finally, after that, then you can go into the paragraphs of the surah. And again, that is going to be a pretty big project. Some scholars, it's become a bit more of a trend now, which is really good, that some translations of the Quran are starting to put surahs of the Quran into paragraphs, which is a really good new contribution, which is not blameworthy, it's actually positive, right? So this is just an example of where you are in, and what I've actually discussed, I don't think anyone has done, at least in the English, Urdu or Arabic language. I don't know Turkish, I don't know Indonesian, I don't know all the other languages as well. I don't know if they have done it, but at least in these 3 languages, which are Urdu I'm not so great at, but I can understand a little bit, but they are not in these 3 languages. So this is an example of where you can make up, you can contribute, and I think it will be a really good positive contribution in terms of making the Quran accessible to people so that they can use the Quran not as a book simply as a book of barakah and reward, but more importantly, a book of guidance.
On the floor.
Thank you. We have certain surahs like Al-Fatiha for healing, or Al-Waqi'ah for sustenance. So it has,
So you can just repeat that again. We have certain surahs like Fatiha for healing.
yes, or Al-Waqi'ah for sustenance. So
Sure.
it has certain specific benefits. Could there be a link between those associations and the tawfiqi nature of the surah names?
Yeah, so one of the things that the scholars use, like from the 15 things that I was able to, extract from how the scholars determined an aim, one of the things that they looked at were virtues and what scholars have actually said regarding a particular surah. So for instance, as you mentioned, Surah Al-Waqi'ah as being connected to sustenance, then I'll have to find out whether it is something which is, whether it's authentic, where did this come up, who came up with this, is there a hadith based on this? So all those things have to be determined. But there would be, if there is a connection between these things, then surely it would be, it will reveal itself in the tawqifi, in the aim of the surah, right? So for instance, when you mentioned Surah Al-Fatiha as being an example of a surah that heals, because one of the names of Surah Al-Fatiha is Surah Al-Ruqya, because the Prophet referred to it as Ruqya, because when one of the companions did Ruqya using Al-Fatiha on an individual, the Prophet said, how do you know that it was a Ruqya? It's more of a description than a name, to be fair. But then how does this connect to the aim of Fatiha? Because one of the aims of Fatiha is that one of the ways that it can actually be understood is that it's like a summary of the entire Quran. So the fact that it's the summary of the entire Quran would show us or point to the fact that it's a very powerful surah. It represents the surah, the Quran, and so it's got that healing power, as an example. So there is actually, but it's important, and I suppose this is the reason why I'm doing this research, is that it's really important to follow and be methodological, because anyone can try to justify something based on something, but it's not. They haven't looked at everything, right? So, and maybe you will accuse me of doing that by just focusing on the name, but I'm even within that, I'm actually trying to be as true as possible in making sure that I'm not pushing for a particular aim, or I'm pushing for a particular, choosing one name over another, but there's a particular criteria that I'm following in order to reach that conclusion.
Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Any last questions?
Several questions. We spoke a lot about methodology, and I was wondering if you have advice for PhD students as well on their journey in ensuring that they develop a strong methodology, and sort of what that journey looked like for you as you came to this.
In terms of developing a methodology for everyone who does any future research, I'm not sure what to say, because my methodology is very niche. I'm looking at, the way that I looked at it is that I try to do devil's advocate as much as I could. So for instance, when looking at the name of the surah, right, then I have to look at it from a linguistic perspective, like what name of it, a name has multiple understandings, right? One word can have multiple meanings. So then, what name am I really referring to? Then the second thing is, I suppose the criteria came through the research that I had done. So for instance, the very first criteria that I came up with as part of my methodology was to look at the tawqifi or ijtihadi name, which is part But then when I'm doing that, then I have to come up with, then I have to determine what kind of name I'm looking at. So is it the linguistic name? Is it the, metaphorical understanding of the word? Is it the theological? So that was natural to come up with that. Then the third criteria, which is looking at the aim, this is connected to my third chapter. So my third criteria is based on my third chapter, and that is to gather all of the aims of a particular surah and then try to come up with something. So I don't think it was that difficult. It just came naturally by it unraveled as I was going through research. But one of the things that I would say is, is anyone doing a PhD, by the way? You're doing a PhD, okay. Should I mention his name? Controversial. Anyway, there's a very controversial person who's like, I won't mention his name, it's going to upset me. Even now he upsets me, but he was actually a good guy at one point. So I said to him, and he's like a professor at university, and he's done a lot of interesting work. And he came and he gave me some advice on my PhD. And in actual fact, there's another brother as well, Salah Sharif, if anyone knows him, he gave me similar advice as well. And that is, this sounds really bad, but try your best to write as much as you can. And because actually what happens when you're reading, it's very easy when you're doing your PhD, you're doing a lot of research, you're reading and reading and reading. You've not written anything down, so it's just like, it's all in your head, but you need to be tactical and get something down, written down on paper. Otherwise you've got nothing to show for it. So it's really important to write as much as possible. What this professor told me, which is really interesting, what Salah Sharif told me is actually quite interesting. He said, try to write as much as you can. He said, my professor would refuse to have a meeting with me, a monthly meeting or bi-monthly meeting, whatever, until I had written a certain number of words. And that was really good advice. That was brilliant advice. But the professor told me, which is really not the best, but I know where he's coming from, which is, it is good advice. He said, try to write your whole PhD, depending on what kind of PhD it is, because it may be that you're doing something related to science, which would mean that you have to do something in a lab, wait for the hypothesis and results and all that kind of stuff. But if it's not like that, and it's just something which is theological or something historical, then he said, write the whole of the PhD in like 3 months. Yeah, he said, write everything, and it's actually a good idea. Write the whole of the PhD in 3 months, after you've read all that kind of stuff, and then you just spend the following year just editing and justifying and all of that kind of stuff. It's good advice for certain people, but I think for me it wasn't, because I had certain presumptions before I came into this site, and some of those presumptions were shattered, right? So this idea of the name of Surah Al-Qur'an, I honestly came into the PhD and thinking that I'm going to prove it. I'm going to basically do what Suyuti couldn't, because I've got a bit of time, right? And I can bring all the narrations together and prove that the names are Al-Qifi, and then I will be able to connect the name to the name. And it will be a really easy PhD. I'll be able to do it quite easily. But through this process, it was really humbling, because it took me on a completely different journey where it was the case where I found that they weren't. And this is the reason why I had to navigate through the research and be taken where the research basically, where it basically took me. So I mean, that's the only thing I can actually suggest. I'm not sure I answered your question very well.
Alright then, Jazakallah khairan Sheikh for this event. It's always nice, sometimes you don't think there's much behind something, and then you find out how little